Awesome. Okay, well, hi everyone. Thanks to those who have joined us this evening and set aside some time in your precious, relaxing period. So, just some housekeeping, as you can just hear, we just started recording. So, the first part of the session will be recorded and then disseminated at the later date, but there'll be a Q&A session later on that will be not recorded. So welcome, and my name is Jonathan Erawan, and I'm joined with some fellow members of the Embodied Carbon Working Group at ACAN here. So we have Mariana, Andrea, and Devi as well, who's been working really hard to put together this event for you this evening. We represent ACAN, so Architects Climate Action Network. So we're a network of individuals within architecture and related built environment professions who seek to take action to address the twin crises of climate and ecological breakdowns. And as you can see on the screen, our mission is to mobilize a new movement of professional activists towards this goal by building an open, supportive, inclusive organization. ACAN empowers individuals to proactively seek change and facilitates collective effort through a shared platform built on collaboration. We have three aims, as you can see on the screen. So decarbonize now is number one, and we seek to radically transform the regulatory, economic, and cultural landscape in which our built environment is made, operated, and renewed in order to facilitate rapid decarbonization of the built environment. Two, we seek ecological regeneration, advocating for immediate adoption of regenerative and ecological principles within our built environment. And three, looking at cultural transformation, so a complete remodeling of our professional culture. So how we can start to challenge and redefine the value systems that's been at the heart of our industry for such a long time. So how can we do this together? So today is actually, we wanted to inaugurate a new campaign in alignment with this. Maybe an alternate inauguration to the one yesterday, but what we want to call it is the ACAN Carbon Clinic. Which was envisioned in the past to bring together built environment professionals to share their knowledge, experience, and woes when it comes to the implementation and adoption of LCAs in their respective organizations. And the aim of the campaign is to foster greater dialogue and consistency between us in our efforts towards better standards and consistency in our world of LCAs. So with that in mind, these are some of the earlier topics, but we have an opportunity later that we wanted to open up to everyone if you wanted to join in and start defining what we want to talk about next. So the first kind of activity that we'll be doing together, I think, will be a poll. So if you can start to scan this QR code and answer. And whilst you have that ready, I'll pass that over to Mariana. I'm just going to leave this page just for 1 second.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. I think for today, for the first session, we decided to start the series by asking some questions around the role of the life cycle assessor. More specifically, who can be an assessor, what sort of knowledge and skills an assessor should have, and most importantly, how can one go about gaining that knowledge? As most of us know, currently there is no prescribed route to becoming an assessor, and the RICS professional standard does not necessarily call for an assessor qualification. In fact, under the standard, an assessor is the person undertaking the assessment. But more and more professionals within the built environment are undertaking this role, and some of them are quite successful and good at it, including our guest speakers for these sessions. So we are truly honored today to welcome three incredible speakers, all of whom have generously agreed to share the journeys that they took into either becoming a life cycle assessor themselves or mentoring others and contributing to the guidance that shapes how we conduct life cycle assessments in the UK, or both. Their brief for tonight was to share their personal experience in developing their life cycle assessment skills, but also to share some advice that they might have for others that are starting their LCA journey now, both in particularly in this changing landscape of guidance and training. And it's a changing landscape of guidance and training, an enriched landscape in no small part due to the contributions that our speakers have had. We hope that their personal journeys might inspire those of us who hesitate to dive into LCAs, but also might provide valuable insights for those of us who already carry out LCAs for some time. So, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Lisa Bowles, who is a partner and head of sustainability at Hawkins Brown. As part of her day job, Lisa manages the environmental intelligence team at Hawkins Brown, striving for a low carbon and socially aware built environment. She is also a member of many cross-disciplinary industry groups campaigning for improved performance standards and sustainable outcomes, including the RIBA, RIAS, UKGBC, LETI, NLA, and TIPSI. She was one of the co-authors of the 2023 edition of the RICS professional standard and is also a task force member for the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. Currently, Lisa is also a mayor's design advocate working with the Greater London Authority. Following Luisa's presentations, we will be hearing from Thomas Heslenberg. Tom is a senior structural engineer and sustainability consultant at Elliott Wood, where he is actively involved in delivering their mission to engineer a better society. He has also played a key role in developing the structural carbon tour with iStruct and is passionate about maximizing building reuse to create thoughtful, well-designed, and sustainable structures. Another important thing to mention about Tom is that he is an active member of the ACAN Embodied Carbon Group, and up until recently, he was actually a coordinator of the group. And last but not least, we are delighted to be joined by Mirko Farnetani, who is an who is an associate and firm-wide embodied carbon leader at SOM. Building on his over 18 years of experience in the construction industry, both as a sustainability specialist and as an architect, Mirko's day job is to oversee the performance of all of SOM's projects by integrating carbon abatement and regenerative strategies in their design approach. In July 2023, Mirko was appointed by the Westminster City Council as one of the expert members on their design review panel. He's a member of LETI steering group and has contributed to some of the publications that have significantly shaped the conversation around embodied carbon in the UK, namely the LETI Embodied Carbon Primer and LETI Climate Emergency Design Guide. Mirko is also a guest lecturer at several universities and colleges, including the University of Bath, where he teaches life cycle assessments, embodied carbon, and responsible material sourcing. The Atlantic Technological University, where he teaches circular economy, and the Royal College of Art, where he has lectured on material supply chain and circular economy. So, if there are no objections, we're going to start with a 15-minute presentation from each of the speakers, and then we're going to move into a more informal Q&A session. Lisa, are you happy to start?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks
Great.
for the intro. I think that means some of my first slides are going to be really quick. So next one. My name is Louisa Bowles. I run the environmental intelligence team at Hawkins Brown. Next one. And the next one, I think, hopefully we can just start. So our team works across a diverse range of outputs. We work with industry. Obviously, we share our knowledge, but we're keen to learn as well. So it's a knowledge share. We do a lot of research in practice. We apply that to our projects at Hawkins Brown, and we see ourselves as an embedded part of the design process. And for us, that's really important. Next part. The environmental intelligence team, we work in an embedded way. So we deliver services. We also improve the performance of our projects internally as well. And that's key to our approach. It's also more fun. Next one. So as Mariana said, our brief for today's talk was to give a little bit of a lens into maybe how we developed our LCA skills, because it's a relatively new discipline and new set of knowledge in the industry. So this slide, I guess, introduces the sort of first 15 years I spent at Hawkins Brown. I joined as a part 2. I followed what might be considered a reasonably traditional architectural path, so learning the ropes from inception to completion, a range of projects, a range of scales, a range of different sectors, so science, technology, higher education, schools, communities. Ended up leading a studio varying between 15 and 20 people, but all the while being part of the Green Group and managing that alongside. And that's probably a pattern which is relatively familiar to a few on the call. So next one. Next slide. Yeah. Yay. So I guess the next steps in the journey just show that one thing can lead to another, and you don't necessarily know where you're going to land up, especially in the world of research, you know, until you take the opportunities and just start exploring. So I guess the pivot moment for me was in 2012 when the practice made the decision to co-fund some research with UCL. Because I was involved in the Green Group, my task was to choose the right person. We partnered with Yair Schwartz, who maybe some of you on the call also know. He's quite a senior lecturer now at UCL, and we're still in touch. Yeah, talk quite a lot. But also to manage the connection between Hawkins Brown and UCL and the collaboration. We knew pretty much zero about LCA at this point. We were just interested in it as a topic. We were doing a lot of creative reuse projects at the time, and we thought knowing about this extra layer of information and data or evidence might be fruitful for us in terms of creating another layer of arguments through planning at the time, which was quite tricky actually to justify some retention and refurbishment projects. It might add another layer of justification for us to push through things that we thought were the right thing to do. So Yair joined our practice in 2013. One of the outputs of his research ended up being HBER. It wasn't the starting point, but it was one of the endpoints. At the time, we were working on a flagship sustainable building for the University of Newcastle and also just launching into BIM. And so Yair helped us harness the information in our 3D BIM model, all the material quantities, taught us how to apply carbon factors to the materials, and then allowed us to respond to client queries around the embodied carbon of the facade choices that we were making. I think one of the things I realized from this very simple calculation quite early on was it wasn't just the upfront carbon emissions of the material itself that you were trying to put forwards. The numbers that we came up with actually had a far bigger story behind them, and that's for me was the thing that interested me. So it was how the facade was connected back to the building, what it was doing to the structure behind it, how it was impacting other emissions that we might be making, and also the maintenance and the life cycle of those materials. So how often were the materials going to need to be replaced, and quickly realized through this very simple facade calculation that there was a lot more to it. And I suppose that for me was the really interesting bit. And then the second bit was how to communicate all of that complexity to the client in order that we could make a joint collective decision. And then subsequently, HBER version 1, which is still on our website, was developed into a more sophisticated sort of online centralized platform for us to use internally. So next one. Yeah, so HBER version 1, 2018, it was launched. So I guess about 6 years ago, 6.5 years ago. We designed it originally to automate the process of extracting quantities from our BIM models and then applying color codes to materials. Hopefully it goes without saying that after the launch of the tool, we no longer knew zero about LCA and actually knew quite a lot. So it was a massive learning curve. And then fascinating opening for us into a very complex field that we're still learning about today. We published a little booklet which went with HBER version 1, which focused on some of the key takeaways that we had learnt through doing the calculation. And I guess for us, that's the really important thing. It's not just doing the calculation, it's what you then do with the information once you have it and how you're going to influence the design or a decision that you're going to make. So in order for the information to be useful, we realized we have to structure and communicate it in a certain way. At this point, we were using the RICS 2017, which had obviously been launched only a year before at that point. We decided to focus on color coding the materials because we thought that a designer would react far more strongly to quite a visual way of communicating and being able to identify hotspots. And some of the observations we made in this little booklet are actually still, things that we notice when we're doing analysis today. So although some of the numbers are now a bit off, the actual core principles that we found out when we first started doing LCA are still quite true. For example, don't just look at the finish that you're putting on. It's actually everything behind it that generates quite a lot of the emissions. And always look at the influence your decision as an architect, for example, is having on the structure, or there are just some inherent high carbon aspects of ground conditions or a sloping site, or so a lot of the learning from this original booklet we still holds relatively true. Next one. We quickly realized HBERT version 1 lacked quite a lot of features. It wasn't granular enough for a start, so we applied for some internal research bursary to fund version 2. And this allowed us to spend more time on honing the data structure, centralizing the data so we could benchmark it, designing a web platform so we could centralize it. And we worked with our software developer, Fabric, who we're still working with on our next iteration of the tool. Next one. And this is one of the outputs. So what we were really trying to aim at was a one-page quick story of the building in carbon terms. So the splash screen that HBERT version 2 allowed us to automate had all of the key embodied carbon data on it, all of the key operational data on it, and what we hoped was a graph that would provide the balance between emissions and offsets, or sort of mitigations, let's say renewable energy potentially, or different ways of storing carbon. And what we hoped was, as people started using the tool, they'd quite rapidly achieve a balance. That hasn't really happened, but the ambition was there to try and communicate how to do it. Next one. So all of this knowledge and learning has been channeled into various industry projects, as Mariana said in the introduction, that I've been privileged enough to be involved with and, share my knowledge and learn from others. So LETI, Embodied Carbon Primer and Emergency Design Guide. But then a year later, the Embodied Carbon Target Alignment, which was a really fascinating project and involved trying to align this data with a lot of other organizations like REBA, for example, in the 2030 Challenge, who were doing the same thing at the same time. And then all of that led on to being involved in the next iteration of the RICS standard. Next one. I think additional research, alongside this, we've been converting our HBERT tool into BERT. So this is fully aligned with the principles of the RICS version 2. The project's being run by Dewi, who was on one of your introductory slides. Dewi joined us about 2 years ago, specifically to lead this project, and it's been a great learning curve for all of us. We're at beta stage at the moment. We just received some accelerator funding. We're seeking more investment. So if anyone has any angel or VC leads, that would be great. But some of the driving factors of this were that we need better data at the early stages to make the bigger wins. Hence our focus on the feasibility tool of this tool, automating typical material quantities for really quick optioneering and payback times, as you can see on the screen. And that we need to massively upscale refurbishment. So we spent a lot of time on the refurbishment element of the tool to make it more streamlined. So the massive benefit of this against new build, which often happens, could be really clearly visualized. And we tried to make the tool really intuitive and visual, and for designers, so that they could, and for lay people, so that they could do some of this analysis themselves before they get someone a bit more experienced involved at the later stages. So that next one. And then there's been other amazing experiences. Again, Mariana introduced them, but working with NLA, MES Design Advocate, working with the London Assembly, hopefully on, and hopefully that will carry on over the next few months around helping or advising where we can on the next iteration of the London plan. Maybe one of my interests is seeing where the whole life carbon and circular economy could be drawn a bit more closely together in what comes out in the next iteration. And of course, the net zero carbon building standard. Next one. So the next steps for our team are being involved in creating content for the CIBSE accredited LCA assessor training. And we're involving pretty much the whole team in this because we think it's a really useful demonstration of our collective skills. Some of the modules we're collaborating on speak to where we're interested about this as a practice and as a team. So we're looking at things describing how to set the project up for success, focusing on the role of an LCA assessor, not just as a technical role, but also the softer skills about being a clear communicator, using your knowledge to drive emission reductions through the design process, structuring the inputs for the LCA to make sure that the results give you the outputs you think you're going to need to create those arguments and decisions, and then presenting the results once you've got them so that you can have that really decent conversation with someone who might not have all the technical knowledge. Next one. And of course, alongside all this industry campaigning, there's been quite a lot of advocacy internally to justify to HB that the investment in the skills and the talented team that we have makes commercial and ethical sense. So over the last 5 years since I took on the head of sustainability role, we've grown our skills, our quality of output, and therefore our ability to charge for the work that we do in order that we can reinvest back into it. Next one. So I think if you do want to have a go, there's a couple of slides here. I suppose what I wanted to, one of the points I wanted to make is that my journey may have been slightly different from Mirko and Tom's potentially, in the sense that I came into this field when I was relatively senior in the practice. So in terms of on the ground LCA, I'm probably potentially a bit less experienced, but one of the things I've found really helpful is the scope of influence that I've had in terms of making people aware of the importance of the topic, the upskilling, the education, why we're doing this, the advocacy, how we integrate some of this into policy and get it more well known. And in my view, as you know, if you're not comfortable doing the calculations necessarily, or don't quite know a way in, there are other ways to engage with this topic. So it's not a one size fits all in my view. You know, we need as many people who understand how useful the calculations are and advocate for them in their processes as we do people who know, how to do them accurately and are technically able. But if you do want to make a start, then these are the core documents that we refer to in our team. So we've obviously got the RIC standard, the version 2. There is the UK GBC document that came out last year, almost as a support to the version 2. And it was designed to sort of partner with the document and set out a few things in clearer language and iron out some of the sort of fluctuations, maybe, where you make assumptions and things. And then there's the really useful iStruct guide, which I think Tom will probably go into a bit more detail, accompanying REBA guidance. And then, as I've said, CIBSE are taking over some of the life cycle carbon assessment foundation. So there's a free course on their should be on their website now. And then there's a accredited course, which goes into more detail, which will be launched over phases this year. Next one. And I think the other thing I would urge people to do is just start small. So we started on HBERT. We just took some of our typical facade build-ups and we took a square meter of them and we measured the volume of material in them. So all the studs, all the plasterboard, all the facades, all the secondary supports, etc. And then we started by just applying an A1 to A3 carbon factor that we got from the ICE database. And that's where we grew from. So we developed a library of those. The more you add to the library, the more you need to maintain and keep accurate. So bear that in mind before you start setting everything up. Yeah, I think there's an awful lot you can do without necessarily going like full on into the whole building. Next one. the wider context, the final thing before I sum up, I guess, is also some work that I've been doing through UKGBC Systems Change Programme. And for me, it's been a really useful experience to move out of my more technical role, I guess, into, some of the softer skills like vision setting or storytelling or communication and language. And for me, those are quite critical also at getting some of these messages across. Next one. And I think what's come out of some of the conversations I've had with other people on the program is it's a recognition that we've all got our own personal beliefs in, in sustainability and how we practice what we're interested in. And that's fine. And we've all got our own spheres of influence. And having an understanding of those places where you can influence more can lead to really significant empowerment. So it might be you're in a position in your career where you have a very specific role and a specific level of influence, and that's fine. Understanding how you can use it is really helpful. We need dramatic and significant changes, but they're not all going to happen at once. So if we can do the bit that we're really passionate about in the role that we're in at the time, we're going to make those incremental, smaller changes. And if we do it together and often, then we'll get further. Next one. So this is my last slide. I hope I've not run over too much. So I thought I might just leave a few key things. It's a bit of a sort of brain dump, the last ones, but it's okay not to have all the answers, but do be brave enough to speak out about the things you believe in. I mean, sometimes, and perhaps we've all had the experience of being in the room and feeling like you're the only one talking about these things, but it only takes one person to mention it, and then you might find a whole host of allies. So find the allies in your team or on your practice, build on the relationships so that you start speaking collectively. And obviously, the more collectively we can speak, the more it's likely to happen. It's never too early to start thinking about carbon emissions in the design process. So if someone tells you can't do a calculation or you can't create a narrative around a strategy, it's perfectly possible. So just starting the conversation gets you that a little bit further. Again, as I said, you don't have to feel confident doing the calculations yourself, but find out who can harness those skills. Your role in the team should harness the skills you feel are strongest for you, and that's fine. Make space for the people who perhaps do understand the technical side of it and bring them in at the right time. And for me, that's just as important. We all have a role in play in progressing the topic and hopefully getting some more formal regulation in place. And I've seen some of the other slides, so I think that people will talk about that. Have a good think about what your skills are and what part you can play. And when you do a piece of analysis or manage to get your client to commission it, make sure it's done at the right time and it is got out there, the message is out there and the data and the analysis is used in the way it was intended. So hopefully my stories helped inspire people listening who think, I don't have time to learn all of this, it's just a bit overwhelming. You really don't have to know it all in detail, but give the space to the people who do and empower them and help them communicate with you collectively. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Louisa. I think that was great, and I really like the idea of finding your allies and building on this and on building these relationships. We're now gonna hand over to Tom to tell us about his experience and journey into LCAs. Tom?
Yeah, thanks everyone. Hopefully you can hear me well. Good evening. And first off, thank you to Jonathan, Mariana, and the rest of the ACAN crew who've put this session together. It's great to sort of be one of the first ones for session one for the carbon clinics, and really nice to sort of sit on the same sort of playing field as Mirko and Louisa. I'm a massive, huge sort of Peanuts Snoopy fan, and I thought this is quite a nice first image to start off with being a clinic, pretending to be Lucy, sort of giving advice, and very much feel that it's been a whirlwind to get to this stage of presenting on LCAs with some authority, whilst I'm still learning very much on the job, but there we go. I'll start off in the next slide. So a little bit about me as a bit of background for everyone to have some context. Next slide. Here I am, young, fresh-faced, still got a beard and brown hair, but less grey. I studied at Cardiff University, where I did my M.Eng in architectural engineering. I did a course with a year out in Europe, where I studied in Germany. And straight after university, got a job at Elliott Wood as a graduate structural engineer. First few projects I got thrown into were retail, which were mainly refurbishment projects, and then some schools as well. Starting off in our Wimbledon office for a few years, then having the opportunity to move internally to our London office, where I then started moving over into the sustainability team. Next slide. For a little bit of context as to who Elliott Wood are, we are a structural and civil engineering practice predominantly. However, in the recent years have also got a sustainability team, BIM, and transport services. We're sort of led by our values of being brilliant, flip it, step forward. We have our ethics, which we drive by, with version 2 being released last year with the company's 30th party. We've released Full Circle to Reuse Guide with B Corp, and we sit, our offices are based within the Society building, formerly the Building Society. Next slide. There were very much sort of two things in my career at the early stages which led me down the path that I am taking now. The first was joining Elliott Wood's green team, so sort of similar to Louisa's with Hawkins Brown, where they have their green group. We had our own green team. This was a small group of engineers who would meet on a regular basis. We would sit down with KLH Sustainability, who would come in, and we would sort of have an insight into the world of sustainability, how we could drive lower carbon or sort of carbon reductions in our designs, what else we could look out for. And then the second was to undertake my first embodied carbon comparisons. Through the green team and some of the efforts of key members such as my old colleague Penny Gowler, they set up the first sort of iteration of the Elliott Wood structural carbon tool. Those of you who may have come across the iStruct's version, which I'll touch on in a bit, will recognize that this version looks very different to what we have now. And it was very much a simple Excel-based spreadsheet, which it still is, to be fair, but A4 in size, very minimal inputs, but would give you the results. And it was all based on the back of Rix's first professional statement released in 2017. This gave us the chance to just understand the carbon impacts that we had as structural engineers, mainly primarily looking at the primary and superstructure and substructure. Our jobs as structural engineers are probably a lot easier than that of architects in understanding our carbon input or carbon impact, which I rather say, because we sort of deal with the massive, with sort of the big structure, and our sort of build-ups are not complex. They are either the simple RC slab, steel frame, a lot more easier to break down as opposed to some complex facades that we can see from architects. So next slide. I thought I'd throw in these sort of 3 statistics midway through that also came off our ethics, where of the 33.1 billion tons of man-made CO2 created worldwide, 40% is attributed to the construction industry. To the demolition and excavation debris from the construction industry represents 63% of the annual UK waste, and an estimated 80% of products' environmental impact is determined at the design stage. So these sort of 3 stats really highlight the importance that us as designers can play within projects and inside the construction industry, and sort of sets the tone. Many of you would have been sort of familiar with the first stat, but sort of that last one of we can have the design stage at 80% is quite significant. Next slide. So what has that led to? That has led to today. So there's sort of 6 highlights that I've pulled out. assisted now with the launch of the structural carbon tool, which is in partnership with the iStruct version 3 is out. And that's been a real learning curve of updating the tool and getting it sort of into a position that aligns with RICS and the structures. I now sit within our company's sustainability team, which was started in 2022. And we're now a sort of team of 12 strong, doing a whole range of different services in sustainability fields. And that's been quite eye-opening of having to learn more just about above and beyond of structures. I've set up the Elliott Woods internal carbon handprinting, where we use our structural carbon tool to monitor the embodied carbon of our projects over different stages. And that's all collated into a small dashboard to ease of understanding how we're comparing and how we're doing year on year. I tutor at a number of universities, Westminster, UCL and Brighton, where I get the sort of great opportunity of sort of learning from the next generation, but also getting to impart some of the knowledge I've had over the few years. Been very fortunate to be one of the founding companies of Engineers Reuse Collective, which launched in December last year, and be sort of open to more engineers joining in the next few months. And also one big step, and I had to go back through a lot of WhatsApp messages in the ACAN Embodied Carbon chat to see when my first introduction was, and that was back in 2021, I believe, where I just sort of threw my name out there and very quickly got chatting along with loads of others, sort of comforted by the fact that everyone was learning about embodied carbon, understanding its true impact, and then sitting with Jonathan and Mariana as a coordinator for a few years until stepping back last year. But that's been really great. Part of the things that we did were including submission of a petition for Regulate Embodied Carbon Now, which involved a very cold standout of in front of one of the government buildings whilst we took in one of the petitions, which was great. Next slide. I guess to sort of where I've started to where I am now and still learning, there's been some lessons that I thought I'd sort of share. Design codes are guidance. What I mean by that isn't to say that they shouldn't be ignored. They are there as a guide. And for those of you who are engineers in the sort of on the call, will be familiar with the live loads that we apply onto buildings, and some architects and others will be as well. And there's good studies out there that sort of demonstrate what we actually design rooms or offices to be of 2.5, and the actual reality of what that looks like. So the message there is we can and should strive as engineers to be as efficient as possible in our designs, and also take into consideration, whilst aligning ourselves with standards of guidance and making sure that we're designing safely, but that we're not over designing and being over conservative. The next slide is sort of also next point is incremental small changes can make a big impact. It's not always the case that you need to do something radical in your design to bring the carbon massively down. You can also make smaller changes working collaboratively with the design team to demonstrate how you go from the starting figure of 500 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per meter squared and trying to bring that down collaboratively of making small changes. Could you look at sourcing your steel from elsewhere? Could you look at, I know it's sort of a slap on the wrist, but GGBS into your concrete, sort of increasing that marginally in the right places. Does the concrete mix need to be as strong as it is? Some points there. And whilst we make the biggest impacts at the design stage at the very beginning, there are still opportunities later on to make them further small incremental changes. And the third here is it's not all about carbon. I appreciate this is an embodied carbon and carbon clinic, but always we need to be mindful of the other elements of the sustainable world, and what impact we're having as designers and as LCA assessors, I guess. Next slide. And then whilst putting this presentation together, I went back through all my photo albums sort of to when I first started and to now, just to sort of see if there was anything that rang true. And these are two images that do. The one on the left is a brown coal excavation site in West Germany near the city of Cologne, which is essentially just a huge hole in the ground where they're constantly dredging out brown coal and shifting along the plains of that part of Germany. And it's just, you can stand at certain points and just see the expanse of it. So which leads to the second photo of a Cologne fan with his goat mascot right in front of an impressive Queen's Guard. And that's meant to represent the huge tasks that we face as designers or as carbon assessors to trying to reduce the carbon emissions of our industry. It may seem like we are small pawns in this, but we working collaboratively as design teams can make the impact and stand up to the construction industry's sort of love of being carbon intensive as it is. So yeah, I've got a couple more slides that I thought I'd quickly rattle through. The first being a sort of impact of structure. Next slide. And this is just to very quickly touch on, you know, many of us might be familiar with this, but just to sort of highlight upfront carbon, the A1 to A3, the product stage is the biggest impact. And that is that extraction, raw material supply, with then the construction stage transportation and construction stage being the smaller pie elements. Next slide. Comparison of materials. We've got sort of the three: concrete, steel and timber. These are the key ones that engineers love to work with. Concrete involves a sort of nice dramatic process. Concrete is excavated from the ground, turned into cement, turned into concrete, built, and that building at the end of its life has to be demolished with a wrecking ball, crushed and downcycled. The reuse opportunities are very limited, but obviously studies are happening to try and improve that. Steel, again, extraction of raw materials from the ground, turned into iron ore, turned into steel. When the buildings come to the end of its life, it can be demolished or can be disassembled and still can be recycled. Timber, the trees absorb the CO2, that gets turned into a whole range of different timber materials that we can use for construction. And then there's a whole range of different ways that we can disassemble the building, have the timber recycled, or it has to be burned. Next slide. Looking here at concrete and its upfront factors. These are the figures taken from the IC database version 3, just sort of, you know, the savings that can be made to GGBS. What we have to be conscious of is that whilst you can increase up to 70% or greater sometimes, GGBS is a finite resource. And you can say, oh, the 50%, that's good enough for 36% saving. Where else can we make savings with strength gain changes and so forth? But it's just a nice slide to see what impact it has at changing that GGBS. Next slide. And this one's looking at steelwork in terms of the carbon factors. And I'll touch on reclaimed in a second, but you can see we use in the UK the average consumption mix of 1.74 kilogram CO2 equivalent per tonne, which sits sort of in between blast furnace steel, which is what we produce in the UK predominantly, and then there's the steel from scrap EAF, which is what we are moving to in the UK. But in France, there are a number of EAF plants. There is XCarb out there as sort of as an alternative, which with a much lower A1 to A3 carbon factor. And then reuse still sits there at only 50 kilograms CO2 equivalent per tonne. Really highlighting that sort of benefit of, you know, let's reuse now. And then looking at timber on the next slide, here are sort of those emissions with the benefit of biogenic impact. So we'll use the timber, there's some emissions that get associated with that, but we have to sort of enjoy the carbon saving that comes with it. But at the end of its building's life, that biogenic carbon is transferred out of the structure into the next product. So whilst many will sort of do their carbon calculations and be surprised that timber doesn't actually fare too well in comparison to some other of the concrete or steels, this is sort of the reason why, and don't be too disheartened by it, but we have to be focusing on the upfront at the moment of A1 to A5, and that's the biggest impact we can make, especially now, reducing carbon now. Next slide. Just a very quick reminder on the importance of focusing on embodied carbon. You can see here in the 1970s, operational was significantly sort of the bigger chunk of carbon emissions for buildings. And over the years, we've been working hard to reduce that in operational and hoping by 2030 to be net zero. But what's gotten bigger as that process has gone on is the embodied carbon. And that is where the focus of the carbon clinics, I guess, will be going forward, is looking at the reduction in carbon. 65% of embodied carbon is in the structure, and that's why a structural engineer sort of fell into focusing on that world, and that's from the LETI guidance. And next slide. This is just sort of the benefit of looking at secondhand materials. That A1 to A3 upfront has a huge sort of benefit to it, but push it down with reuse brings down the carbon. Sorry if someone's unmuted themselves. I've got a few more slides. Next slide. Design approach. Next one. So just looking at design hierarchy, this is how the IStructE and many others have adopted the sort of focus of what we should be doing as an industry. We should first use less. What it means, do we have the option to build nothing? Can we maintain the existing building or build less? So we refurbish it instead of demolishing, build clever, optimize that grid, build in layers, future adaptability. Or the next one is build efficiently and then minimize waste. Finally, it's specify low carbon as sort of the next resolve. And the last resolve that should be considered as part of the design process is offset. That's by far the easiest thing to do because it's a quick sort of click of your fingers. But in actual fact, it's incredibly difficult to justify the offset. And it's, yeah, so that's sort of the last thing that we should be considering when we're looking at design. Next slide. Embodied carbon by elements. This is sort of a nice 2 graphics or 3 graphics of number of stories and what has then the bigger impact. These might be old references, but kind of proves, you know, in smaller buildings, the roof might have a large sort of impact on the embodied carbon, but as you go taller, the stability starts to grow. Foundations become less significant, but still have some impact. Next slide. And then it's the humble grid, the savings that can be made by just making your grid more efficient by actually reducing it. Whilst you might think, oh, I'm putting in a whole number of more columns, you're actually massively reducing the embodied carbon of your structure because you are reducing the span length and that depth of steel beam or beams in your structure. So does the grid need to be 9 by 9? BCO guidance recently updated itself to reflect this, that grid doesn't need to be massive for BCO compliant building. You could actually have a smaller grid. So if you're in a project and your sort of engineer has proposed a huge grid, or you're looking at pushing the size of between columns, is that necessary? Sort of, and then you can see the carbon savings that come with it. Onto the last 4 or 5 slides. Next slide, industry action. So what's already in place? There's the policy that's driving industry. The London Plan is a big player in that, with major developments needing whole life carbon assessments and circular economy statements. Next slide. There's the required legislation and action that we've been calling for. So Part Z, if anyone's not familiar with that, definitely give it a Google, go onto their website, learn about it. There's a big driver from the industry to push this into building regulations. That means that we would have to do embodied carbon calculations. And then there's also the action of the Engineers Reuse Collective. There are the 6 sort of founding members. And what we're trying to push is engineers to collaborate and share experiences in reuse of materials and learn from each other to push the industry, push ourselves to doing better with our structures rather than just relying on virgin materials. Next slide. And as Louisa touched on, there's the resources that are available. The How to Calculate Embodied Carbon guide came out, version 3, as of yesterday. And this aligns itself with whole life carbon for built environment, RICS version 2, RICS version 2. There is obviously the LCAs Climate Emergency Guide, which we'll touch on further by the others. And there's the whole Part Z document too. And my last slide is the big announcement that, as I've already mentioned it, that the structural carbon tool is now live on the iStructures website. It is a free resource. So I recommend that engineers online and architects, if they want it, to download it and use it. And if you've got any sort of find any problems with it, tell the iStructures, who will tell us, and we will make sure we try and fix it. But it should be foolproof and a really great tool for sort of comparing 6 schemes and comparing them. And that's me. So thank you very much for listening to me. I'll pass on to Mirko.
Thanks, Tom, for that. It was really good to understand where you came from and some of the history. And then, yeah, we'll hand over to Mirko now.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so first of all, thanks, Andrea, for the invite, and to ACAN to organize everything. Obviously, yeah, next slide. Okay, so a few slides about myself. I think Mariana has already introduced me very well, so less detail here. I'm an architect by background, but specialize in sustainable design as well, and particularly in embodied carbon, whole life carbon, and circular economy as well. So I am a BREEAM AP 2, and so let's say at the beginning of my career, I worked as an architect in the first 5 years, and then I decided to enroll for a master at UCL in environmental design and engineering. And so from 2012, I started working more as consultant rather than architect. So at the beginning, I dealt with dynamic thermal modelings. And then from 2014, I started my career more dealing with carbon and circular economy. I mean, the top 5, let's say, experience are going to be detailed later. So I would say, next slide, please. Okay, so just to give you a bit of background, this is a slide to show you, a few engagement I had over the years, taking part in events, lecturer, and etc. Next slide. Yeah, and here a few publications where I was involved. Perhaps it could be a good reference for all of you as well, because of course they are relevant to what we discuss now in terms of embodied carbon. Next slide. Yeah, this is another list of publication. Anyway, so next slide, please. Okay, so Because, of course, the focus was to talk about personal experience in dealing with embodied carbon. I thought that a timeline could be the best way to describe what I did. So in other words, I started dealing with embodied carbon in 2014, particularly joining Sturgis carbon profiling. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah. Okay, so one back. Okay. So yeah, I started in 2014, and when I joined Sturgis Carbon Profiling, I don't know if all of you know about this company, but at the time, let's say it was I would say, a specialized company dealing with embodied carbon and life cycle assessment. I have to say that in 2014, the carbon interest was not as developed as it is at the moment. And developers, particularly the main developers we were dealing with, they were basically using the embodied carbon and life cycle assessment as an innovation aspect of their delivery, obviously. So in this case, well, back in time, I was involved, in a few projects. Well, I have just showed here the main. So the Google headquarters, the expansion of Gatwick Airport, the Rich Canal in King's Cross, and then the Verde SW1 in Victoria area. I mean, during this period, I was one of the co-creator of the Sturgis carbon profiling database, and then of the Sturgis carbon calculator. It is the calculator which is specified in the GLA or life carbon as well. I mean, during this period, I was involved in a few publications. So those three are perhaps, I would say, the most important. I was involved, and I think particularly at the time, Sturgis Carbon Profiling was the lead author of the RICS Professional Statement, which was first edition. So in this case, what happened is that, part of my research in the company was incorporated into the first editions as well. Yeah, next slide. Okay, so yeah, let's say after Sturgis Carbon Profile, I moved to BRE, and I have to say it was very interesting working for the BRE because at the time I was involved mainly in research projects. And I think the focal projects where I was involved from the beginning till the end was BAM 2020 or Building as Material Banks. I mean, perhaps a few of you know about this project, but anyway, it was a project to enable circular economy in the construction industry. So in this case, I was the technical lead for LCA, and particularly when I was at BRE, I developed the CBA tool, the environmental module of it. So the CBA, which is the acronyms for well, circular building assessment. So it was formed by a few modules. One of them was the environmental assessment module. Then there was the integration of BIM, and also the life cycle cost as well was integrating within it. I was involved in other projects as well. Perhaps one of the most interesting was GelClad, which was the development of a innovative facade module. I think if you search online, you can find particularly those two projects. I would suggest you to look for the BAM 2020 website, because it is still active, and there is a lot of literature in it. I mean, the publication which is on this slide, it is the D14, and it is the publication where I was a co-author as well. And it takes into consideration a few pilot projects that BAM consider for developing the research projects. Next slide. So in 2019, I was massively involved in LETI, particularly in the design guide and in the embodied carbon primer. I think it was interesting because the idea for the embodied carbon section was to be a section within the climate action design guide. But because we produce a lot of material, at the end we decided to prepare a separate publications for it. So I was the lead author and the lead of the embodied carbon work stream at the time. I think it was a pretty intense job for all of us, because I think perhaps we didn't have free weekends for a few months. But, you know, of course, we were very happy to see the results of it, because to be honest, from my point of view, and particularly for me, it was an unexpected success. And so, you know, this obviously pay back, you know, all the effort spent on it. Yeah, next slide. So my experience at Hilson Moran, obviously it was very interesting, because in a way I could put in practice all the previous experience gained through the previous positions. And what I did was I basically changed the delivery of all life carbon, which was at the time based mainly on BREEAM. And I basically shift that to the GLA all life carbon requirements. So when I was at Hilson Moran, I introduced the cradle-to-cradle design approach as well, which was a kind of translation of everything developed in the building as material banks at BRE. And particularly it was very interesting because, I mean, all of these design criteria were basically used for designing and build the project, the cooperative steeple Claydon building. There are a few links. So perhaps, you know, if you are interested in understanding what it is, you know, you can click on those links and find the projects. I think at Hilson Moran, what it was very interesting for me was that I was particularly involved with the GLA. This because it was nearly after the launch of the LETI embodied carbon primer. And so in that case, you know, as LETI, we were basically asked by the GLA to take part in, you know, the guidance that was during the draft version at the time, 2020. And I was asked by GLA to provide, data for the benchmarks. In this case, obviously, all the data came from the projects developed at Ilson Moran. Being involved in project delivery, what was very interesting from my point of view was to be involved in this project here, which is a development in Holborn. The development of this building, particularly delivering the all-life carbon requirements, basically inspired the publication of, let's say, inspired the fact that the City of London was contacted, and the outcome of this project basically were used for obviously developing the carbon option for the City of London. At the time at Ilson Moran, I was asked to review the I3T carbon publication. And I think this was very interesting because obviously it could be possible to see the way to phase carbon from a structural engineer point of view as well. So when I was at Ilson Moran, I was appointed by RIBA to deliver the core CPD in 2021, and the title was All-Life Carbon Strategy for Small-Scale Projects. I think the CPD should be still available. If not, if you would like to have it, we can ask RIBA if it's possible to still deliver it. So feel free to ask me. Next slide, please. Okay, so in my current involvement at SOM, I think, so let's say my main focus at the beginning of my involvement at SOM was to create the all-life carbon service. And then obviously I created other aspects of the delivery of this service as well, particularly because in order to create a service, obviously it needs a lot of add-on, meaning, for example, a database that people can use in order to perform assessment, and particularly to have accurate results across all the members that carried out, obviously, the assessment. At SOM, I run a firm-wide training program, and this is basically embrace more or less all the disciplines. I've got a on-demand training session as well. So in this case, anybody from any different discipline could basically ask if they want to obviously get knowledge in this field. And I think it works very well because there are a lot of, let's say, curious people that normally ask for, let's say, I would say a lot of questions, but obviously in terms of training as well, that works very well. Let's say my involvement, in my involvement at SOM, I was part of, those 4 main publications. So the first one on the left, it is the CIPSI for North America. The second one is the RICS professional standard, where I was one of the contributors. And then the next 2 on the right, there are 2 publications coming from 2 research projects. So the first one is in collaboration with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the US. and building transparency, where we have basically developed the end-of-life carbon factor database, so that the designer could basically design end-of-life of buildings during the design stages, of course. The second publication, the far right, it is a research project carried out with Autodesk, and particularly Autodesk wanted to develop something, to connect BIM and carbon. So the project was, the project working group was not only by SOM Autodesk, there were other partners as well, and the publication basically is a summary of what we did. All the publications obviously are available online, so it's enough for you to search for them. So in my experience at SOM, I was also appointed by the City of Westminster as one of the members of the design review panel with a specialism of embodied carbon circular economy. And it's very interesting, obviously, to be part of a local authority and to do review of projects, obviously. I have to say that from my point of view, another interesting aspect of being part of a global company as it is SOM is that it is very useful for me to have a dialogue with people in different areas of the world, because you can really see a different approach and a different mindset. From my point of view, this is very useful to enrich knowledge as well, personal knowledge, obviously. It is also very useful because we operate globally, and often we are in countries where where we don't know the market, and of course we have to understand how the market works. For example, I could mention the Philippines or perhaps Saudi Arabia as well. It is an amazing lesson learned, because it is very interesting to obviously explore the differences between what is happening in this part of the world, meaning Europe and UK, and the rest of the world, particularly in the US as well, where at the moment I'm developing a training for a California a scheme called the Kyle Green, which is a kind of London plan all life carbon guidance, but perhaps not so demanding as it is in London. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so I have a few milestones just to give you more example of what I did. So this particular is a case study of a facade development when I was involved in a project in the King's Cross area. This is, it used to be called the T2, but now it's called the Rich Canal. This picture are publicly available in the Syria publication that I was the author. And also this study is part of the narrative in the RIBA publications as well, particularly the chapter 2, case study 2, where I am the co-author. Just to give you a bit of background about this, so this happened, I think, in 2015, when, let's say, I was not so experienced at the time, but I think is worth mentioning, obviously. So in this case, I was the lead consultant for the project, and after assessing the project, which was more or less 60,000 square meter, so I realized that a big chunk of the carbon, the full building carbon footprint was coming from facade. So, I mean, of course, I wanted to optimize the carbon footprint of the building, and therefore I started checking what it could be done for decarbonizing the facade. Now, the initial idea was the left-hand side facade layout, which was more or less a fully glazed facade and a facade louver, of course, to prevent direct sunlight penetration. And I mean, of course, in this case, I was trying to understand how to reduce the carbon, and I went through a couple of different routes. So the first route was to explore a alternative layout, which is that one on the left-hand side, the right-hand side. So in other words, instead of to have a facade louver system and the fully glazed facade, the idea was to reduce the glazing ratio and to introduce a side panel, a solid side panel. I mean, of course, this kind of approach generated 22% embodied carbon abatement. But because I wasn't happy, I was keen to explore other solutions for decarbonizing the facade. And so what I was thinking was instead of to have a fully aluminum frame facade, the idea was to use a composite frame facade, meaning internal frame in timber and external frame in aluminum. As you can see from the two facade layout, only by going from aluminum and timber, of course, there is a drop, obviously. But if you compare the far left and the far right, where, you know, let's say the facade layout is different and the frame is different, of course, you can see a pretty considerable abatement, obviously. So when this happened, I presented these results in front of the design team. I mean, at the time, video call was not a business as usual. So I remember I was myself presenting the results in front of, there were a lot of people, you know, facade engineer, architects, structural engineer, and etc. And so I explained the concept, and then of course the meeting went on, and that's it. So after a few days, I remember we received, you know, I mean, new facade development by the facade consultant. And obviously, I was very surprised because both facade consultant and architects were following, you know, my recommendation, meaning reducing the glazing ratio and try to omit as much as possible the facade louver system. I mean, for me, it was a great success, obviously, because particularly I was at the beginning of my career. Perhaps here was after, I would say, 1 year or 1 year and a half. So it was very satisfactory, I have to say. Okay, so next slide. And perhaps is that the two facade types, obviously, were able to, well, let's say the alternative facade types was better performing in terms of U values because obviously there is less glazing surface, and therefore was a win-win situation, obviously, because lower embodied carbon and lower, you know, operational carbon too. Okay, so next slide.
Sorry, Mirko. We're just running out of time because there's like a
Oh.
hard limit for at 8 p.m. So we might have to skip directly to the Q&A if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But yeah, we can share the slides a bit later as well. So the information will still be available for people.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you wanted to get in contact with Mirko directly, yeah. So just with the Q&A, we'll stop the recording now.